Our next contest of the Better Photography Weekly Challenge is Meaning in Chaos. Our judge and mentor is Rohit Saha. An alumnus of National Institute of Design, Rohit works across multiple formats such as photography, illustration, and animation to weave a story. Over the years, his projects revolve around communities, landscapes, and political phenomena. His project, titled 1528, won the Alkazi Photo Book Award in 2017. And a year later, he was honored with the Magnum Foundation Social Justice Fellowship. Rohit's work has been featured in Pix, The Indian Express, The Caravan, and Magnum Foundation, among others. Hello and welcome, Rohit.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here. Let's just straight get into the discussion of. Uh, when you look up the definition of chaos, it means complete disorder or confusion. Or to more understand chaos, we can also look at the present times we're living in. It's pretty chaotic. Uh, so you know to define or to describe chaos, or how I got attracted towards this entire term, I would talk about my journey with photography. So my and even understanding how chaos can be represented, like it can be silent. Issues like mental health, or things, domestic issues which are not that loud out in the open. So indirect way of documenting chaos. Or it can be chaos can be loud, like documenting protests, riots, wars. uh, so chaos can be read in many different ways. How I got introduced to it was, it was the first time, like when I came across Fostik's work. Like I think, he was my neighbor when I was living in Calcutta, and like I know him from quite some time, like from my school days. And when I was in my first year of undergrads, I came across his work called My Uncle Tukka. Now, this body of work revolves around his uncle, who had lost, the ability to hear and speak at a very young age because of monetary issues and medical negligence. Through this work, Swastik wanted to pay a tribute to a human being who lived in utmost silence for more than 4 decades in one tiny room with all his imperfections and perfections. Uh, I still remember, like when I first saw the body of work, apart from being such great photographs, it was more about resonating with the person I was, looking in the photograph, and it made me feel that, maybe he's my uncle. It was not objectifying someone, but it was more about being human, to look at what was happening around. And I think this was one of the first images I saw in his Facebook, I guess, or in his then website. And I was like, and it so I did not understand what it did to me then, but it made me feel a lot of things, and I think that feeling stayed with me for a long time. Even then, like this is one of his earliest bodies of work. Even later on, in other bodies of work that Swastik did, called Hungry Tide, it also talks about a different chaos, environmental chaos, and people's life in it, but it's in a different way. But going back to those times when I was, looking at Swastik's Uncle Tukka, he soon introduced me to the other photographers during that time. He was talking about his photo circle. So during that time, he took me to this exhibition in Calcutta, I remember, where Ronnie Sen was exhibiting. So Ronnie Sen is a Calcutta-based photographer, filmmaker, writer, and a lot many other things. And he was exhibiting his work from his college days. And I still remember it was three cluster of photographs on the wall, and the photographs were placed very tightly to each other, and it automatically gives you a sense of, okay, so much chaos happened in those 3 years. And the middle section of the body of work was the work which he was photographing while returning back from his college, the 12-hour long journey he used to take in those unreserved Indian Railway. And I still remember, like looking at those images of stark, high contrast black and white. in your exhibition space, where, and I'm talking about 2010 and 2011, when photography is all, it's being fancied, right? Facebook is filled with new photographers, and it's all scenery and good looking photographs where it's visually pleasing, but that's that. But when I was looking at Ronnie Sen's work and Swastik's work, it made me feel something which was more than photography. And I was like, I was getting attracted towards it. It was like, this is something that I want to do. I want to try doing it as well. So I think in these photographs, Ronnie talks about the chaos in the present sense. When you look at this photograph, you feel that sense of suffocation that all the other people are living there, and also an experience of Indian railways. So these things kept happening, and I was getting more, I was seeing more photographers, but these things were more like milestones for me understanding which direction of what I crave for. uh, Soon some days passed, and I got to know about the movement, the Provoke movement, the 1960s and 70s of Japan. Provoke movement, whose subtitles read as provocative documents for the sake of thought. And so when you read a line something like that, it already creates a lot of questions in your mind, like what am I going to see that will create these repulsions, or repels in the water. So they chose a very radical new aesthetic, or the arbor bouquet, which was roughly translated as the greeny, rough, blurry, and out of focus. But to understand Provoke movement, we need to understand few photographers, how it came around. So to understand Provoke, I think we should start from this photographer called Shomei Tomatsu. Shomei Tomatsu was the first photographer to explore the post-war Japan and like its ambiguous relationship with United States. So we need to understand when he was born, the war was still on. So it was 15 years. When he was 15 years, the war got over. So for him, life was very different, right? So for him, he was born in chaos. If you can tell about that thing, about what was happening around. So Tomatsu's first series of disabled veterans in Nogaya and Pottery Town in Aichi recorded poverty after war and how the artisan culture was affected, right? And Tomatsu also traveled to Nagasaki in 1960 to photograph what remains after the 1945 atomic bomb. So these are photographs of things that people were not photographing then. When photography came out, they were photographing sceneries and beautiful flowers. But this is the way of documentation which was talking about the deeds of America, where the so-called Japan was saying, okay, there's a lot of industrialization and urbanization happening, but the people of Japan were still very close to their traditions, their old methods of living. So they felt very angry about it, and this was their way of documenting it. So I think, so Tomatsu was doing this, right? And then in 1963, he meets the very own Takuma Nakahira. So Takuma Nakahira is this art critic and a photographer. So he wasn't into photography at that time, but he was writing a lot. He was writing essays on photography. So Takuma Nakahira was an editor for New Left, and that was the time he met Tomatsu. And through Tomatsu, he met Daido Moriyama. So it's like, so these three people are meeting, and they all have similar thoughts, and they all have the process. So they're jamming of understanding, okay, what could be done. So Daido Moriyama was telling about his techniques of shooting and developing quickly. And whereas, Tomatsu was talking about what he was photographing. And I think that was the time, 1968, Tomatsu, Takuma Nakahira founded Provoke. And in the second edition, Daido Moriyama joined. So it was a crazy time because, they were exploring this chaos in their own ways. So Provoke was born in a political environment. Like it was a year of huge social and political unrest in Japan, rapid post-war industrialization, urbanization, and which was more like questioning Japan's traditional social structure, right? And so they tried. So even though they tried to get used to this change, they were feeling very oppressed with this new government policies. So the photographers created this new visual, the arbor bouquet, which is against this entire technical sophistications that Japan was promoting. Now, so to understand these things, right? So in Provokes issue 1, this is what they said: the status of language and reality, right? And in today's life, right, the whole idea of fake news, what is real, right? The language. So I find it very resonating with what was happening then and what is happening right now in the present time. So they say today, when words have lost their material base, in other words, their reality, and seem suspended in midair, photographer's eye can capture fragments of reality that cannot be expressed in language as it is. So to see now, just now to see Tomatsu, like whom I was talking about, talking about his hostility towards the American present, where we see action, high contrast, and you feel the power. This is the photograph of the bottle that he did in Nagasaki. It looks like a form of meat decomposed, but you look more into it and realizing what has happened. Portrait of one of the survivors. Then this is Takuma Nakahira, self-portrait. So I feel, when we're talking about chaos, you can mix all kind of photography. It's not pertaining to any form. It can be self-portrait, it can be abstract, but it should evoke a feeling that's happening around. I think that's the power of photographs for me. A photograph which can, I think, because in today's world, this visual thing, the visual memory is so less because we come across so much visual data every day. But if something can make you feel something, that stays longer than a visual memory. And I think that is what happens to something that's a great photograph. Uh, then Daido Moriyama's The Dog. Uh, when you look at this dog, uh, first it looks like a feared or a scared animal, very aggressive animal. But on the other hand, it also looks like an ancient animal or a mystic animal which has come to life, because the Provoke movement kept on, going back between the modern and the past, and the classic and the fables, and how they kept talking about demons and the relevance in the present day society. And I think this photograph, is definitely a well-known for Daido Moriyama, but it's also a great representation for the entire movement, Provoke. Again, Daido Moriyama. Here he was already deconstructing photography. I think with Provoke, they were not questioning to what to photograph or how to photograph. Instead, they were questioning why photograph, or what is photography, who is a photographer. And with Dido More, he was destroying this whole tool of photography. Like he was doing all those things which we are asked to do in photography, in the sense with the principles of taking a photo, of how a photo should look like, the lines, the shapes. He was just reconstructing it, so that it also gives a representation of the so-called chaos that he was living in. Daido Moriyama, again, a scene from the accident. And along with, so, being said that Daido Moriyama was also, following the American culture. He was very impressed with Andy Warhol and the so-called pop culture happening around. So even in his photographs, he was photographing and reprinting and rescanning so that the photographs start losing details and it's just blotches of black and white. And again, there's another group of photographers, which is like the third part of Provoke, which is formed by Ekio Jose and other photographers. And Ekio Jose is not photographing like a documentary thing, but he's more into fables. He's asking his friend to enact this character, representing fables, talking about social issues. talking about the so-called chaos. Yeah, right. It can be so, all these photographers, they're talking about the hostility towards the American presence, their ambiguous relationship, both hate and attraction towards this, and also the ancientness of rituals, which they were more interested in, the countryside, than the city urbanization. But being said that, they were not saying the countryside is the best side. They were also saying it has demons, it has this, it has that, but they were more used to that. Then, again, another accurate photograph from the same Kamiitachi series. Kamiitachi series. Then, so when the first time I read about this called this time Chaos, it reminded me of Joseph Kodelka or his book, right? And I think he's one of the most renowned photographers when we talk or think about this entire term called chaos. So Joseph Kodelka was a Czech-born French photographer known for his seminal photo books on gypsies, right? And Soviet invasion on the Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Black Triangle, a region where with a lot of environmental devastations. So I think him spending time like 15 long years, 10 long years with communities, understanding him that he is an outsider to the place, but yet trying to understand by living there for long. So I think his work talks about the experiences of alienation, conflict, despair, waste, loss, departure, and many things that he was facing himself and even the people around him was facing. So I think, even if you look at a photograph like this, it's from his book series called Gypsies, where these three boys, it's about how they're mimicking the Western power. It's a kind of life they're living, which is, stark, beautiful, dark, sad, harsh, everything. And more than visuals, I definitely, it's a very strong visual, but it's also the feeling that it evokes, which makes it much more stronger. The another very famous, the Kodelka picture, where he photographs a dog crossing somewhere in France. Many also say it's his self-portrait, where he calls himself the exile, always moving here and there, documenting life, looking at life. So, I think these are very strong uh, visuals that help us to understand how these photographers, spoke about their mental state, or, whether it's out external or internal. Mm, yeah, again, from gypsies. And these things happen with the spending of time. The more time he spent, the more he saw, the more he experienced. This is from the book Chaos. That was his last set of work, which are basically panoramic shots of environments, and he spoke about the man-made devastations done to the environment, and the way he's looking at the land, and how it's already evokes a certain like emotion of destruction. And so I think here, even when I'm trying to explain the words, that feeling, to explain how we feel, I think that's the power of these photographs. And like great masters like Kodelka has done it. Then another great photographer, Robert Frank, also known for street photography. But when we look at the Americans, right, I think it was one of the most renowned piece of body of work that came out in 1958. And when it came out, people were not really happy with it because it did not show the American dreams. It was more like American reality, which no one was ready to talk about. And with even in this body of work, it was all grainy, blurred, poorly composed photographs. Not poorly according to me, but what people during that time said about art photography, about the neatness and the cleanness, they were like, no, this is not cool stuff. But soon later, they understood that what Robert Frank was doing, was showing the reality around the surrounding people, about what people were facing from America. A funeral shot. I think the Americans not only stands as a record, but it's the particular time in history where it gives us a many understanding of photography, life, and everything else around it. Uh, like I think it's also a commentary on what the world celebrates as the American dream. How fancy is the American dream, and how true is that? The cover for the Americans, and I think it's the all details in the photograph, and it's not just single photographs here. It's definitely like there are all these shots are powerful by themselves, but when you look at the context. So what I want to say here is the context is really important. It's not about what do you have to photograph to represent chaos. It's about what is it that makes you feel chaotic, or what are you trying to represent that you think is chaos, and how do you represent it accordingly. So I think that's the way. Like when I look at this photograph, I see a very fancy car, I see industrialization, but I also see a man standing on the roof. And I think these are the dynamics that he did. And I think there are around 72 photographs or 80 photographs in the book, but he made thousands of shots. It's not 72 shots, it's thousands of looking at America and understanding and coming to a point where he decided to put this book in the edit. And I think after understanding Robert Frank, the photographer, which I really relate and look up to, is this guy called Matt Black, and his body of work called Geography of Poverty. Geography of Poverty talks on similar grounds, not same, similar grounds. So Matt Black is an American documentary photographer whose work is based mostly out of poverty, migration, and environment. So he looks at poverty area where the rates are above 20%, determined by the US states. So what he did, it's an ongoing process. It began in 2015, and he traveled like 100,000 miles, 46 different states, documenting, documenting this whole truth, which is a commentary on the American dream, which is becoming an American illusion. So I think when like I'm very glad that I have one of the first test copies of this book, and I really cherish the book because it's very strong. It's not just poverty. It's what happens in a place which is poverty stricken. It's not the people but the space. It's about the life there. And like there are photographs which are like this, and it's dark, and it already like at first when looking at the photograph, America doesn't come up to you in your head. But when you look more into it, you understand that, okay. So I think that's the power of photographs. And chaos can be beautiful, chaos can be powerful and ugly, and it's everything. So I think chaos is a very strong term and a broad term, mm, to try to define to something very small. So they are great examples. But being said that, I don't want to say that, when you're talking about chaos, it has to be black and white or high contrast black and white. It can be a color photograph. It can be a color photograph talking about intimate daily personal life, like Nan Goldin's Ballad of Sexual Dependency, where it's a so Nan Goldin's Sexual Dependency is a deeply personal body of work and experiences between 1970s to 80s, where she traveled from Boston, New York, Berlin, and many other places, documenting the queer culture, the transgenders, the and many other experiences. So it's a document of her experience. And so she says the experiences vary from ecstasy to pain. There were a lot of sex, a lot of drug use. Then there was the joy of childbirth, and then there were loss of people dying because of AIDS. So it's and in between a lot of personal tension, fights, and many thing around it. So what Nan Goldin did was something that stayed, and I think that's one of the most powerful work I've ever come across in the world. Uh, these are personal, these are private, these are powerful, and they're silent yet so loud. So, and that's why I wanted to talk about how it's not black and white or color. It's about the context, like what it is being expressed. Being said that, from Nan Golden, we go to Richard Billingham's work, where he's an English photographer who started off as a painter. And when he was in his school doing his project, final year project, he wanted to paint about his family. And since he came from a very dysfunctional family because his father was an alcoholic who had lost his job, his mother was fighting with obesity, and then he had his brother, and they were not agreeing to sit or stay at a place for long, so he couldn't paint. So he bought himself a toy camera and started photographing them, and which gave birth to photographs like this, which later became a book. And I think it talks about chaos in a very beautiful way, in a very sweet way. And it doesn't need to be full of riot and hate, but you living in a family and just accepting what is happening around you. you know the photographs are beautiful, gritty, fun, and everything. And this is one of the most famous shots where, and I think this photograph stays in my head. It's I get reminded of photographs like this. So, and to end off the discussion, I would talk about Saurabh Snow. Like, people know him for many other, definitely all his works are brilliant, but with Snow, I think it's a very silent work, yet so loud, yet so powerful. So when you go to his profile, his website, he reads, a look at Kashmir through the prism of the arrival and departure of the three phases of winter. Mesmerized and deceived by snow at first, as it starts to melt, so does the mask of denial start to strip off my face, and I, the outsider, start to come to terms with the land that I find myself in. I think being placing yourself as an outsider, understanding your place, and then venturing, and then understanding what the land has to tell you is, and let the land give you photographs, then you taking photographs and making photographs. And I think this is, for me, when I looked at this work for the first time, I couldn't stop looking. It kept on happening, and I kept on looking, and it still stays. It's not what you expect from the photographs when you think of Kashmir, but it's way more silent, and it's way more everyday life scenes. But now this scene stays more because we don't see these scenes more. uh, why? Because when we look and think about Kashmir, we get to hear about everything that is happening there. And the violence that is portrayed in the television, we are some kind of induced to it because there's violence happening everywhere. And we are like, okay, violence war. But when I look at these photographs, they shout way louder than the violent photograph that I see. Not saying and not demeaning the violent photographs at all. Incredibly, they're really powerful photographs. But I'm talking about the audience itself, about what the audience feels and reacts. Like, another book that comes to my mind when I talk about Kashmir is Witness. It's such a strong body of work, talks about chaos with such a gathered voice. Definitely powerful. And it's equally, I'm not saying this body of work is more important than the other, but both are equally powerful. Both talks about chaos. And these are the different ways I feel like, one can look at chaos and try to understand chaos. And after talking about all the great masters, Saurabh again, like, I can't stop thinking about this photograph ever, is because what I read, what he writes, what I know about, everything comes together with this photograph to me. And I think this photograph, this is, I think, goat blood after a festival. But when you look at the photograph and look where the photograph is taken from, I think that creates the power what a photograph needs to do. So after looking at these works, I would try to make sense of what my work lies and how I try to connect. This body of work it's a spread from my book called 1528. It talks about the many extrajudicial killings that has been carried out by the Indian Armed Forces from 1979 to 2012 in Manipur, a northeast state in India. While working there, I volunteered for an organization called IFAM, which was formed by the widows of the victim families. And they were gathering data collection forms from the families so that they could write a petition to submit at the Supreme Court. And that is when I came. So when I got to know about Iram Sharmila breaking a fast, I entered Manipur. I got introduced to Ifam, and before entering Manipur, I knew Malum massacre was the worst that had happened there. But entering Manipur, working with Ifam, and opening a cupboard filled with 750 files, I got to know the 33 year of violence and 1528 recorded killings. So the documents, what I was going through, were documents talking about the victims, the perpetrators, and how the victim was last seen. And they became the text of how I was looking at Manipur. So I was reading these documents every day, and when I'm stepping out of the office, I was just reacting to the space I was walking in. And I try to juxtapose the newspaper clippings with photographs that I made in Manipur from 2016. And it's an ongoing process, it's an ongoing book. But I published a book in 2019 called 1528, but it's just chapter zero to the entire journey. Another body of work that I want to talk about is a body of work that I began in 2015 called Gregor. It's based on Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. It's based on Gregor Samsa. And what I tried to do here was, like, I tried to think of myself as a photographer living in the time of Gregor Samsa, who got to know about Gregor passing away after he turned into a bug in a newspaper. So the photographer went to Gregor's house, tried to photograph the surroundings, and after coming back, he tried to recreate what Gregor Samsa went through when he was living his last days before he passed away. So this process was, I told my friend called Savine, who himself is a painter and who knew how to pose. So I explained what I was going through that time, and I also explained Metamorphosis. And I asked him to act for me as Gregor Samsa, and I photographed him in my room while I was at NID. And this project I photographed in 2014, 2015, but I keep going back to this series again and again every year, where I reprint it on different materials and I try to write on it and make different forms of it. So right now it's in a form of a video, but I think this is another form which was somewhere done between 2016 when I compiled it in the form of a book. And that's that. Uh,
So, do you have any tips for the participants? Anything that you would?
yeah, I would say, you know, don't be scared about what you can photograph and what you can't photograph. I think about what you want to talk about. If you have that point very clear, your photographs will happen automatically. And then, since they're all single photo submission, right? So I
Yeah.
think context here really makes sense. You know, so both should be equal. It shouldn't be like this. So I think where both the context and the visuals are as a match, then it becomes a great shot.